Okay, today I am reviewing Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I absolutely loved this book. I mean, what a fun book. Very enjoyable to read, very well written in an easy to read way, lots of very imaginative stories. I feel like I learned a lot about Norse mythology or Norse folktales. You can't really go wrong here. It's a very short book, which initially, when I picked it up from the bookstore, kind of attracted me because I was like, oh great, here's a quick, easy read. I'm not going to get bogged down in it. I'll knock this one out very easily. But then actually, as I got into it, do you ever have a book where you're dreading getting to the end of it because you're enjoying it so much? So you're like, oh, I don't want it to end. I want to keep reading this one. And then it ends up just being too short. This was one of those books where initially I was very attracted to it because of its short length. I'm quite busy these days, so my reading list has taken a bit of a hit. And I was, shifting position, looking for a bit of a shorter book. But yeah, then once I got into it, I discovered I was really enjoying it so much and I didn't want it to finish. But possibly that's not Neil Gaiman's fault. It's quite possible that there's just not that many surviving Norse myths to retell, as he notes in his introduction. I should note, I'm a complete newbie as far as Norse myths. I mean, before reading this book, I had watched the Thor movies. And that was more or less all that I knew about Norse mythology. So I'm not going to be critiquing this from the view of an expert. I can't talk about what he left out or what he left in or compare it to other renditions of Norse mythology. I'm only going to be reviewing this as somebody who's completely new to it. But I can give my impressions based on that. And I completely enjoyed it. In fact, this is one of those books where I'm almost reluctant to say too much about it because it's just a delightful little collection of stories here, and to maybe say too much about them would spoil them or would run the risk of spoiling them. So that being said, because this is a video review channel and because this is what I do on this channel, I'm gonna get into it anyways, and I'm gonna give all my random thoughts about everything I thought about this book. But do consider this a forewarning, maybe, that if you haven't read this book yet, maybe stop the video here, go to Amazon or go to your local bookstore or whatever, buy this book. It's such a quick and enjoyable read, and just read it first then, and maybe come back and watch this video after you've read it. But yeah, it's the stories were so charming, and Neil Gaiman is such a good storyteller. I say that as somebody who gave a mixed review to American Gods. I reviewed American Gods on this YouTube channel and didn't hate it completely, but did give it a rather mixed review. But this I found just absolutely delightful. And again, as somebody completely new to Norse mythology, this is my first introduction to it. I can't really vouch for how authentic Neil Gaiman's dialogue is to what was in the original myth, or what was in the original, I believe it's called like the Prose Edda is one of the major sources for these collection of stories. But I can say it read quite well, and it felt modern, and I mean that in a good way, in that you have these stories from 1,000 years ago or more maybe, and there is a bit of an ancient feel to them, certainly, a bit of a fairy tale feel to them, but it is also mixed with a little bit of a modern prose in the retelling. And I thought maybe I would read a section from this book that illustrates how Neil Gaiman does that quite well. with maybe just the right amount of a fairy tale-esque type narrator, but mixing in a little bit of a modern style. So I'm taking this out of context, obviously, but this is the gods have all been arguing about whether or not to take on the offer of a master builder, and this isn't going to make complete sense out of context, but I hope maybe it still serves to give a bit of a flavor from this book. "So," said Odin, the All-Father, "we are decided. We say no." There was a dry cough from a corner of the hall. It was the kind of cough intended to attract attention, and the gods turned to see who had coughed. They found themselves looking at Loki, who stared back at them, and who smiled and held up a finger, as if he had something important to divulge. "It is worth pointing out," he said, "that you are ignoring something huge." "I do not think we have overlooked a single thing, troublemaker of the gods," said Freya tartly. "You are all overlooking," he said, "that what this stranger is proposing to do is, to make no bones about it, quite impossible. There is no one alive who could build a wall so high and so thick as the one he described, and have it finished in 18 months. Not a giant or a god could do this, let alone a mortal man. I would stake my skin on it." At this, the gods all nodded and grunted and looked impressed. All of them, except for Freya, and she looked angry. "You are fools," she said, "especially you, Loki, because you think yourself clever." "What he says he can do," said Loki, "is an impossible task. So I suggest this. We agree to his demands and to his price, but we set him stiff conditions. He may have no help building his wall, and instead of 3 seasons to build his wall, he has but 1. If on the first day of summer any of the wall is unfinished, and it will be, then we pay him nothing at all." "Why would he agree to that?" asked Heimdall. "And what advantage would that give us over not having a wall at all?" asked Freya's brother. Loki tried to suppress his impatience. Were all the gods fools? He began to explain, as if he were explaining to a small child. "The smith will begin to build his wall. He will not finish it. He will work for 6 months, unpaid, on a fool's errand. At the end of 6 months, we will drive him away. We might even beat him for his presumption. And then we can use whatever he has done so far as the foundations of the wall that we will complete in the years to come. There is no risk to us of losing Freya, let alone the sun or moon," etc. And it goes on there. But I hope maybe by reading out that 1.5 pages, I've given a taste for the flavor of this book, kind of the style in which it was written. And if you, like me, find that appealing, pleasant to read, then you'll enjoy this book. I mentioned before that in my youth I had read a lot of Greek mythology, but not any Norse mythology when I was younger. And I was a little bit surprised, although pleasantly surprised, to find out that the tone of these Norse myths were so different. They're a lot different than Greek myths, and maybe that excerpt I read gives you a bit of a flavor for it. It reminded me, more than anything else, of the Brothers Grimm type stories, kind of fairy tale, folklore type stories, more than myths, or at least the myths of the ancient Greeks. Sorry, I'm going to adjust this camera. I feel like this is too high up. Sorry. The myths of the ancient Greeks. Or to be more accurate, I found it was maybe a bit of a combination between kind of epic battles of big gods and giants and a bit of a fairy tale-esque element to it. The elements that I find kind of similar to a fairy tale was a little bit hard to put your finger on it exactly, maybe. It's more of a general sense I get, maybe more of a flavor. But there is a lot of, you know, clever little tricks that the characters play on each other, much like the resolutions of the Grimm brothers' fairy tales revolve around little tricks. Some of these stories in here will go on quite a little journey where the conflict is continually changing. So it starts off with one conflict, but then a new antagonist will enter or go on another journey, and then they'll meet another antagonist, and then something will happen to completely change the scope of the plot, which is not unlike some of the Brothers Grimm books, stories. Particularly some of them, maybe the lesser known ones, like the King of the Golden Mountain, or the Boy Who Wanted to Shiver. Or Faithful John. Yeah, some of these in the Brothers Grimm can be quite like that as well. In addition, something, and again, I had been mainly familiar with Greek mythology. Greek mythology, I think, by and large, is largely stories of human heroes or demigods, kind of half gods, half man. Who go out and who have heroic deeds, and they're kind of either guided by some of the gods, or maybe the gods are setting up obstacles for them. I was somewhat surprised to see that in Norse mythology, the gods themselves are the protagonists of the story. So, for example, Thor and Loki will go to the land of the giants, and it'll be about Thor and Loki's adventures in the land of the giants. Not the adventures of like a human hero, but the adventures of the gods themselves kind of are the ones who go on these epic journeys. Yeah, Norse mythology. And again, this is something I got a little bit of a taste of from those Marvel Thor movies. But they believed in these 9 worlds that were all connected by this tree, and there was this rainbow bridge that the gods could travel around on. And so that there is this home world of the giants, so to speak. And a couple of these stories, actually, involve them going to the land of the giants, where it takes on somewhat of the character of like Jack and the Beanstalk. Where they're going around and, you know, everything is giant. I mean, not just the giants, but there are all these oxen, which are also completely huge. And there's, you know, they go into the giant's house and they're hiding under the giant's kettle. And very much, you get the vibe that it's similar to Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack and the Beanstalk doesn't count as Grimm Brothers. That's, I think, a fairy tale from England. The Grimm brothers, of course, are folk tales from France and Germany. But anyways, very much of a fairy tale type vibe. And I think, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but just based on Neil Gaiman's introduction here, combined with a little bit of skimming I did on Wikipedia, I get the impression that most of Norse mythology did not survive down to us. So we've lost a lot of the Greek and Roman epic poems, but we still have a lot of stories about Greek mythology. Whereas apparently with Norse mythology, all that have survived to us is a couple collections of folk tales, which is perhaps why these stories read so much like fairy tales, is because that was the collection that happened to survive down to us, was a folktale type collection. Again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not an expert on this, but that's the impression I got. Which is why a number of these stories read like fairy tales, because I think maybe given that it was just a collection of folk tales which were written down in the 12th century that have survived down to us, maybe these are closer in genre to fairy tales than to what we normally think of myths. Or not. Again, somebody let me know in the comments if I'm getting this the wrong way around. Talking more about maybe the readability of this book. The beginning few chapters are talking about the origins of the cosmos. It's interesting as far as it goes, but it has a sense, maybe like a lot of creation stories, it's hard to get involved in it because it's just a story of kind of strange, weird things appearing and then killing each other or dying, and the world being formed in kind of a strange way. When I was first starting this book, I was a little bit worried. I'm like, oh no, is it all going to be like this? But then around page 30, we start getting into the actual tales of the Norse gods. And then it becomes much more readable and much more like a fairy tale. But yeah, I mean, I'll just read a bit from the beginning chapter to give you a sense. Where the ice and fire met, where the ice and the fire met, the ice melted. And in the melting waters, life appeared. The likeness of a person, bigger than worlds, huger than any giant there will be or has ever been. This was neither male nor was it female, but it was both at the same time. This creature was the ancestor of all the giants, and it called itself Ymir. Ymir was not the only living thing to be formed by the melting of the ice. There was also a hornless cow, more enormous than the mind could hold. She licked the salty blocks of ice for food and for drink, and the milk that ran from her udders flowed like rivers. It was this milk that nourished Ymir. The giant drank the milk and grew. Ymir called the cow Audhumla. The cow's pink tongue licked people from the blocks of ice. The first day, only a man's hair. The second, his head. And the third, the shape of a whole man was revealed. This was Buri, the ancestor of the gods. Ymir slept, and while it slept, it gave birth. A male and female giant were born from beneath Ymir's left arm, a 600 giant born from its legs. From these Ymir's children, all giants are descended. And it goes on kind of in that way for, well, the whole first chapter, and maybe the second and third chapter are a little bit similar. It's not until 31, the treasure of the gods, that we get into the more kind of traditional tales. And for my money, that's when the book really starts getting interesting. I mean, as you can see from that passage I just read, it has its charms. It's interesting to an extent, and yet it is just a lot of names of strange things just being born, and I didn't get to the part where they were killing each other and dying, but yeah, that's in there as well. But then again, I think Greek mythology to a certain extent is like that. You know, we have these tales of Kronos and Gaia and Uranus. Wait, Uranus and Kronos are the same thing, aren't they? But anyways, we do, I think, have a little bit more character motivation in Greek mythology, but we don't have a lot of the pre-history of the mythic world. And I believe Babylonian mythology as well, right? Also has these kind of strange stories about gods killing each other and making the earth out of bodies and stuff like that. So I think that maybe is just par for the course for creation stories of ancient mythology. I don't know. But yeah, once you get through that section, then the folktale stuff starts getting a lot more interesting. The stories are, it's a bunch of separate stories, and yet they do form a broader narrative. So, like a god is born in one story, and then that god will appear in the later stories. Or, Thor will get his hammer in one story, and then that will come up in the later stories. Things like that. And especially maybe some of these are more tighter connected than others. Like the children of Loki leads right into setting up the antagonists that will be there at Ragnarok. And again, the death of Balder leads into Loki's last days, the last days of Loki, as it's entitled, which leads into Ragnarok. That Ragnarok was really fascinating. Again, my first exposure to Ragnarok is that Thor movie. As I mentioned in my video review of that Thor movie, Thor Ragnarok, when that movie came out, I had no idea what Ragnarok was. And then I looked it up on Wikipedia and I thought, wow, this is trippy. This is so bizarre that a mythology can be like this. Even though I had kind of already read the story on Wikipedia, Neil Gaiman's retelling of it was really good. And again, he does a good job of setting up this epic battle between all these gods and all these monsters. And he writes it in the future tense, because according to Norse mythology, Ragnarok is yet to come. So I'll just read a small section of that. They reach the field of battle, and the final battle will begin. Odin makes straight for Fenrir, the wolf, now grown so huge as to be beyond imagining. The Allfather grips Gungnir, his spear, in his fist. Thor will see that Odin is heading for the great wolf, and Thor will smile and whip his goats to greater speed, and he will head straight for the Midgard serpent, his hammer and his iron gauntlet. Frey makes for Sutra, flaming and monstrous. Sutra's flaming sword is huge, and it burns even when it misses. Frey fights hard and well, but he will be the first of the Aesir to fall. His sword and his armor are no match for Sutra's burning sword. So it's not a lot of description, but I thought it did give a good... It took the source material seriously enough to give it a bit of an epic feel there. And by the way, if you've seen these Marvel movies, Sutra, the fire demon, is the same one that appears in Thor Ragnarok. And Fenrir, the wolf, is the same huge wolf that appears in Thor Ragnarok. So, again, it's interesting to read these after having been exposed to these characters from the Marvel movies. It did make me wonder, though, as I was reading this. It's written in the future tense, and it's written like the gods don't know what's going to happen. Like this is all taking them a bit off guard, or they don't know who's going to win these battles. And I was thinking, well, how, coming from a Christian perspective, we're always taught that God knows everything and we know nothing. Here, we humans have the story of Ragnarok written down. So, why don't the gods know about it? I mean, can't they come down to Earth and see the books that we've written? It didn't make I don't know what the Norse explanation of that is. That we humans would know have written down what's going to happen in Ragnarok. But it seems like it's still catching the gods off guard. While I'm on the subject, a lot of these stories, you're like, they sound a little bit too much almost like a fairy tale. To the extent that you're reading it and you're like, do people really believe this? Did they really believe these stories, or were these stories just set to amuse them on campfires? And I suppose you could ask the same question of Greek mythology, right? Now, the Greeks definitely did believe in those gods to a certain extent, but when it came to writing those epic poems and stuff like that, Did they really believe all that happened, or were they taking some poetic and dramatic license with the stories of the gods? You wonder this about Norse mythology. And again, I don't know anything. This is my first exposure to it. So maybe somebody out there knows better than I do about how seriously the people in that time and place seriously believed these stories, and how much these stories were just supposed to be for amusement. Yeah, I guess including the story of Ragnarok. But yeah, what else is there to say about this story, this book? Oh, right. So, sorry, I was saying before, the stories are connected to each other. So each story does stand independently, but you also do get a sense of like an epic mythology as you're reading through it and seeing the different connections. There was every now and again there was something. For example, there was a character called what was it? It was the wisest of the gods, and his name is in the story when Thor gets his hammer, one of the very first stories. And it starts with a K. I can never remember how to pronounce this. Anyways, he's in like the very first story. But then in a later story, which story was it? The Mead of the Poets, we learn how he was created. So that is out of order, I guess, or an inconsistency in the source material. I don't know. But yeah, the rest of it seems to read in chronology, or at least I didn't catch anything. There's an interesting... Neil Gaiman has some interesting notes at the back where he talks about some of the choices he made retelling some of these old stories. One of the things with the last days of Loki, he says here in his notes at the end, one of the things I was really looking forward to when I wrote this book was to tell the story of the Lakasina, a poem from Poetic Edda, Loki's fleeting. And then when I got there, somewhat ruefully, I covered the material I had been looking forward to making a chapter in a paragraph. It's what a drunken, mischievous Loki says to the various gods and goddesses to upset them, and what they say back to him in their defense or to counterattack. It's a wonderful poem, but it felt like it would have thrown the shape of the story off to have included it. This is built up from the Loxana and the prose Edda, Guffaging. Apologies for the bad pronunciation on that. But I get the impression from what Neil Gaiman says in his introduction and from Wikipedia that the prose Edda and the poetic Edda is a source for most of these folktales. But yeah, it's if you go to Wikipedia and look up Loki, at least as of the time I'm taping this, because you know Wikipedia is constantly changing as people edit it, but at least as of this taping, it does have under Loki, the entry for Loki, a summary of the whole exchange he has with all the other gods and goddesses, with what he says to one of them and what they say back and what he says to another one. I almost feel like it's a pity Neil Gaiman left that part out. Because one, as he says, it's really interesting. It's a bit of an interesting back and forth. It alludes to a lot of other stories that I don't know if these stories are told elsewhere, but they're not in this volume. It does give the gods a lot more motivation for what happens next when they turn on Loki. Because the way it's set up in Neil Gaiman's book, he just says that Loki said a lot of things to the gods and goddesses and made them really mad, essentially. But it doesn't actually go into any more detail than that. And at least for me, it was a bit jarring coming from that to the horrific punishment that the gods and goddesses gave to Loki in the following section. So including that whole section with all those insults may have made the book more interesting and given more weight to what they did to Loki afterwards. It would have made the book longer, but, you know, like I said, no complaints on my part. I would have loved to read a longer book. This one was too short. Although, again, if you look at what they've got in